Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John, and I am an author, and I am coming to you here on another Storytime Thursday to read the next chapter, chapter 6 of my first book, The Shadow of the Past, entitled Stone Tunnels and Stone Councils. So grab some tea or some coffee, which is what I'm rocking here, or some wine if that's your thing and it's the evening, or any other beverage you prefer, and settle in here for chapter 6, Stone Tunnels and Stone Councils. Val'inar woke shortly before dawn the next morning and found that a small band of tri-warriors were already preparing to convey Narthan and him to the door of Yrtl. After checking the preparations, he wakened Narthan, and the two of them enjoyed a simple breakfast of bread and milk and were soon prepared to leave. Although it was only a day's journey to the Orthris Mountains, Gilth provided them with some dried meat and bread. A gentle and not unpleasant spring rain was falling as they departed. Val'inar was provided with a chestnut horse and Narthan with a bay pony. After securing their packs to the saddles and having their weapons returned to them, they set out with a small company numbering 8 in total. Once they got beyond the fjord, the horsemen spread out in all directions to ensure that if any unfriendly eyes were in the area, they would have some warning. They rode at a brisk pace for most of the morning and only stopped to rest for a short time as the sun at last broke through the clouds at noon, quickly drying them off. The horsemen talked little and only among themselves in their own language. Elf and dwarf, for their part, were also silent, absorbed in their own thoughts. Valinar's thoughts dwelt upon what was expected of him when they reached the mountains. He had some knowledge of diplomacy, but little practice. He wondered seriously about whether he could help at all. Northan's thoughts also dwelt upon the upcoming meeting between dwarf and goblin, for he knew that, if what Valinar said was true, his people could ill afford a war. It also occupied much of Narthan's attention to stay on the pony. He was well traveled and had ridden many times before, but it was still an uncomfortable mode of travel for him. Val'inar had ridden before as well, although rarely and never on a horse. Nevertheless, he seemed to form a rapport with his almost immediately, and within an hour's time was quite comfortable in the saddle. And when they stopped to rest, he removed the saddle, saying that he could control the animal better without it. As the day progressed, the mountains before them grew ever larger. By mid-afternoon, the terrain had become so hilly as to slow their progress. The mountains dominated their view, but Val'inar could see the gaps between the mountains and all the winding paths carved by nature and by the mountain's inhabitants that would allow a skilled traveler to pass over the snowy peaks just as the sun was setting. Just as the sun was setting, they at last came upon a deep cleft between two mountains, the sides of which were entirely smooth save for deep gouges here and there, which Narthan indicated were lookout points. It was here that the horsemen departed from their company, having borne them to their destination, and themselves having no love for such terrain. At the back of this cleft, about half a mile from its beginning, stood the door of Yrtl, built in an age beyond the record of the Grathik Dwarves, who often called it simply the door. It was a double door which stood some 40 feet high and 20 feet wide. As they got closer, Val'inar could see that it had many carvings on it. In the center, divided in half by the door scene, was a double-bladed axe with a three-pointed crown above it. On either side of the axe were depictions of dwarves mining, smithing ore, carving gems, and feasting. Above the crown there were a number of runes. I, Yrtl, Deep Lord and Dwarven King, do place this door at my realm's west, to welcome friends, but enemies beware, for while my own in the deep halls dwell, so stands this door till Terra's end, thus I decree protection eternal. He turned to Narthan to inquire about the meaning of the inscription and saw that his companion staring at him open mouthed. He asked what he was staring at. Narthan replied, You can read that? Forgive me if I have committed some offense, replied the elf. I did not realize that I had read it out loud. It's not that you read it aloud, stammered the dwarf. It is the fact that you read it at all. Are you sure that you've had no dealings with dwarves before? I have met the occasional trader, but do not come to the forest often, said Narthan, becoming more puzzled. But you are the first dwarf that I have truly gotten to know. I still do not understand what you are so surprised by. It is the fact that you were able to read those ancient runes at first glance, replied the dwarf, recovering himself to some degree. Only the most learned dwarves can decipher such, and it would take an expert hours to translate what you did in a matter of seconds. How were you able to do that? It was now the elf's turn to appear puzzled. I do not know. Those runes look almost elvish, but I have never seen their like. I merely looked at the door and the meaning came to me. Perhaps, but come, said Narthan, turning to the guards who were approaching from the now slightly open gate. We must make haste to reach Drashatar in good time. He approached the guards, conversed with them for a short while, with the guards repeatedly gesturing toward Val'inar. Having assuaged the guards' worries, the companions were allowed to pass through the door, which led into a long, smooth tunnel that stretched well into the distance. The tunnel was about 7 feet around from ground to ceiling in most places and some 4 feet wide. At regular intervals along the tunnel were torch brackets which illuminated the dark tunnel. As they walked on, Val'inar noticed that on either side there was the occasional doorway, which sometimes led to a room and sometimes to a tunnel branching off. Though stuffy and confined to Val'inar, he could nevertheless feel the breath of unseen vents as they walked through the tunnel. He also perceived that the tunnel was gradually sloping upwards. Without the presence of sun and stars, Val'inar quickly lost track of time's passage. The only thing which broke up the monotony of the tunnel was the occasional dwarf whose path they crossed, and to Valinar's surprise, none of them seemed to acknowledge his presence. After walking for what seemed like hours, Narthan led Val'inar into a small room off the main tunnel. It seemed to be a rest stop of some kind. There were several beds lining one wall, a number of barrels of dried provisions against another, and against the third wall was a well. After consuming some provisions and drinking some water, which Val'inar found quite refreshing despite the fact that it tasted slightly of stone, the two companions quickly fell asleep. Val'inar woke with a start some time later. How much he was not sure in this skyless environment. He was in a cold sweat. It took him several minutes to remember the dream. Once more it was of the blighted field with what looked like a wound in the ground before him, and once more the dream seemed to end just as something was about to happen. He got the distinct impression that if he actually saw the whole event, he would understand far more of what was going on. He was saved from having to try and fall back asleep with such thoughts on his mind by Narthan stirring awake. After taking a simple breakfast and another draught of water, they set off once more down the long tunnel. Val'inar could sense that they were quite some ways up into the Orthris Mountains already, and as they progressed, the number of dwarves they encountered increased. Slowly at first, but soon they were passing dwarves almost constantly. A short time later, the tunnel they were traveling through took a sharp right turn, followed by a sharp left turn, which brought them to a guarded door. From here on, sharp turns and guarded doors proved to be the norm. As they progressed, the dwarves they passed, especially the guards, began to take a much greater interest in Val'inar, surveying him with curiosity. After several more hours of travel, they came to the heart of the realm of the Grathik Dwarves. They began to pass rooms that smelled of hot metal. The air was filled with the fumes from forges, and there was an ever-present clink of hammers about their work. A short time later, they came to what appeared to be a vast cavern until Valinar's senses adjusted to the darkness. He found himself in a vast room carved out of the mountain with a variety of buildings built into the floor, walls, and even ceiling. Pedals led off in every direction. Some in cartloads of stone and metal ore coming in. Others saw carts of cut stone and refined ingots going out to the workshops. Still others had all manner of food. Pages are stuck together. All manner of food and other goods of everyday life traveling back and forth. There were thousands of dwarves moving about the intricate paths and stairs between, over, and under the various rooms and buildings. As Narthan and Val'inar passed, some stopped to stare at the strange tall figure, but most did not pay them more than a glance. As they moved into the chamber, the large raised path on which they walked wound its way towards what Val'inar thought was a great mound of stone at the cavern's center. It was only when they were almost upon it that he saw that it was a tower, 3 stories high, with a large, well-guarded door before it. When at last they reached the tower, the guards challenged them, which led to a long, hushed argument between them and Narthan. The soldiers seemed to regard Val'inar with apprehension and were unwilling to let him pass, until the door opened from within and another dwarf stepped forth and joined the argument. A short time later, the guards finally allowed Val'inar and his escort to enter. Stepping through the door, Val'inar found himself in a long, well-lit hall adorned with intricate carvings and colorful tapestries. At the far end of the room stood an ornately carved throne upon which sat an aged but regal-looking dwarf. He had a high forehead on which was set a thick stone circlet set with a large blue sapphire. He had small brown eyes under thick white eyebrows. He had a small mouth and nose engulfed by a vast gray-white beard that came down to his waist. He was wearing a robe of deep blue over what appeared to be a woolen tunic. His leggings were made of fine leather, as were his boots. His waist was bound by a woven belt bound together by a silver clasp, and a fine black cape upon his back was bound at the neck by a golden clasp. An axe of exceptional craftsmanship lay against his throne. The elf had only a few moments to wait before the dwarven lord turned from discussion with several other richly dressed dwarves and beckoned him forward. Val'inar crossed the room quickly, and when he was 10 paces from the throne, he knelt down before it, as Narthan had instructed, and with his head bowed addressed the dwarf in the trade language. Lord Yrtl of the Grathik Dwarves, I offer you greetings and crave an audience with you. The dwarf seemed to regard him for a moment before saying gruffly in the same tongue, You know courtesy. Good. You may rise, elf, and tell me who you are and how you came here. I have heard tell that an elf had entered this realm, but I didn't think to believe it until I saw you standing before me. Gracious lord, said Val'inar, rising, I am Val'inar, and I hail from the elves of Telmaran Forest. I come by the grace of your Bart, Narthan, who bring you portents of doom and request your lordship's assistance in averting it. High words, growled the dwarf. It is a wonder that you convinced Narthan into leading you here, knowing that you are not the first to come here for aid against a reported doom. What tricks is the Union up to now? Know that I have seen through your tricks. You are thin and have your bladed ears. You are thin and have their bladed ears, but in all else you have the bearing of a man, not an elf. What are you really? Val'inar smiled as if to assure the grim lord. I may not look as other elves that you are likely to have heard of, but I assure you that I am one of that people. My form is more like that of a man because I am what is sometimes called an elf of balance. Val'inar waited for a response, but got nothing save a blank stare. You might perhaps know us by the name Highborn, he added after a moment. Lord Yrtl's laughter boomed through the hall. A highborn? Look, my lords, a creature of legend walks among us. The Union must think we are truly fools to fall for such old tales. What will they drag up next? The Devourer, perhaps? A creature of legend I may be, said Val'inar, attempting to keep his calm, but I am no friend of the Union. I am their enemy, and it is their overthrow that I seek your aid to achieve. You are right to be suspicious of them. Ushar herself came to Telmaran and spun a pretty tale of disaster and promised unity for us as well. I fear that the unity she seeks will stop us from opposing a far greater danger, or perhaps hand this whole terror to it upon a silver platter. Lord Yrtl held Valinar's gaze for several more minutes before replying gruffly. Perhaps you are what you claim, and perhaps you are a clever ruse, it matters little. I mistrust this Telmaran Union and what it claims to seek, but at present they are not my concern. I have other problems to deal with. Narthan has spoken of those problems to me. He brought me here in part because he believed I might be of help, observed the elf. As Lord Yrtl let out another burst of deep laughter. You? How could you help me? How how much could you understand of our problems? I think perhaps that I have worked Narthan too hard, if that is really why he brought you here. Val'inar smiled. If I took Narthan's words correctly, there is little to understand. You may soon be at war with the goblins that live in the western part of the mountains. Correct, said the dwarf, giving Narthan a long look. If those Crel'van fools do not see reason and give us what is ours by right, then it will be war. The question still stands, however, what could you possibly do? I could serve as a mediator between your people and the goblins, replied the elf. Yrtl looked like he was going to burst out laughing, but the laugh died in his throat as he caught sight of Valinar's expression. Are you serious? What makes you think you can mediate such a dispute? Do you know anything about the dispute? Valinar held the dwarf with a grave look in his eyes. Yes, I am quite serious. I know nothing about the dispute save that it is something to do with territorial claims. Not just territory, boomed the dwarf, matching Valinar's gaze. Our claims to those veins of ore stretch back countless generations, and those greedy goblins refuse to acknowledge that fact. Has it really been a source of conflict for that long? Inquired the elf. I was under the impression that this was a relatively recent dispute. I did not know it had such history. The peace has been kept for 10 years now, but the feud is an old one. That the new slowbrag of the Crel'van is brought to a head, said Yrtl. Now answer my question. What makes you think you can help? I will admit that I know little of diplomacy and less about the history of this feud, but I can still serve as a neutral voice at the negotiations, replied Val'inar. With war so close upon you, I would think that a different tactic of mediating would be welcomed. You are honest, growled the dwarf. That at least I will grant you. But I am not willing to hand the fate of my kingdom over to a stranger. War is inevitable. Let it come, and we shall make the Crel'van pay for their insolence. I know that it is a lot to ask, admitted Val'inar, but for all our sakes I am asking you to trust me. Perhaps a war can be averted which would, even if you are victorious, be costly. And if it is averted, perhaps you can turn your attention to the Union, which clearly concerns you, as it does me. So you have said, rumbled Yrtl, but for now you will wait outside. I crave words with my Bart, since he clearly trusts you. At this, several guards led Val'inar out a side door and into a carved waiting room with stone benches set into the walls. The guards took station on either side of the door, and though they watched him carefully, they did not speak or engage him at all. The elf welcomed being left alone to his own thoughts, but found them drifting back to the dream he had that morning. No matter how he thought about the enigmatic vision, he could make no more sense of it. It seemed strange to him that an odd scar upon a withered plain should play such a prominent role in what might be. Val'inar was unsure of how long he had sat mulling over his dreams, whether it had been minutes or hours, when he heard the door back into the throne room open suddenly. Two guards advanced toward him and silently indicated that he was going to go back. He was to go back in. When he had once more approached Lord Yrtl and bowed, he noticed that the aged dwarf seemed to be in somewhat worse a mood than when he had left him. Your tale is an interesting one, but I do not half believe it, barked the dwarf. But you seem to have convinced my bard. You may attempt to mediate the conflict. Thank you, my lord, said Val'inar, bowing once more to the dwarf. Thank Narthan, said Yrtl sharply. He has persuaded me against my better judgment to allow you. There is one final meeting between us and the Crel'van at Med-Il on the border between our realms, 3 days from now. I thank you nonetheless, replied the elf. I will do the best that I can. At this, Lord Yrtl shot Val'inar a fierce glare. It had better be good enough. I swear to you that if you fail, both you and Narthan will feel my wrath. Now, as you have a long journey to make, go. Narthan, who Val'inar learned was going to serve as the dwarves' representative as the meeting, led the way from the Lord Yrtl's abode. After collecting a dozen soldiers, they set out from the western entrance of Drashatar, and the dwarves have that accompanied them were dressed in simple woolen tunics and leggings with chainmail shirts and leather boots. Each had an identical iron helm and black cloak with a silver axe upon the back of it, clasped at the neck by a simple silver pin. They each carried a long double-bladed axe. Val'inar learned in conversing with Narthan that they were members of Lord Yrtl's personal guard. Despite the threat that was placed upon them, Narthan indicated that he thought that the meeting had gone very well. Lord Yrtl was suspicious of what Narthan told him, but he had not totally dismissed it. Narthan seemed to be surprised that he had been able to persuade his lord to allow Val'inar to be present at the final negotiation. Narthan displayed every confidence in the elves' ability to resolve the situation, although Val'inar suspected that at least some of this was feigned to encourage him. Regardless of the dwarf's assurance, Val'inar was becoming less and less convinced as the miles passed that he could actually bring the conflict to a peaceful resolution. All right, that is chapter 6. What did you think? I would love to hear your thoughts and comments on both the contents as well as my reading and anything like that. I hope you were enjoying the reading so far. Clearly, my dog is a fan. I'm pretty sure that's. Yeah, I'm gonna tell him. That's a dog for. You should check out my books, The Shadow of the Past, and the Sunburned Red, both available, linked below. Also, I would love for you to comment, like, share, subscribe. Follow my socials at my website, also linked below. But for the moment, I do hope you all have a wonderful day, get the chance to do or experience something creative, and I'll catch you on the next one.